And Bob Jolly, Athenaeum Director, welcome to everyone. I just want to mention a couple of things, and then Peggy Pearl will introduce Jane Beck. We at the Athenaeum are conducting a patron survey. If you haven't filled one out, we do have paper copies throughout the building. We really do want to know what you think. It'll make the Athenaeum a better place for you, hopefully, and a better place for us if we know what you want and we are able to respond to that. On Wednesday, December 9th, we'll have a public forum here to discuss results of the survey, and also if you just want to come that night and say, I didn't fill out the survey, but you need to hear this. We welcome you to come here and give us feedback. We really want to make the Athenaeum as useful to you as possible. Jane Beck has copies of her book, Daisy Turner's Kin, which will be available for purchase and signing after the talk. I think that's all I was supposed to say. Here is Peggy Pearl to introduce Jane Beck.
I first met Jane when I was at the Fairbanks Museum, and when we had the Festival of Traditional Crafts. And Jane and I would often talk about those things, and she would occasionally come up to St. Johnsbury from Middlebury, and she probably came faster than anybody has ever come. She had a car, and the name of it was an Eagle, and she literally thought it could fly. And but she has tempered that quite a bit now, but she has done a lot in her life, including founding the Folklife Center in Middlebury. And she has spent a lot of time with Daisy Turner that you're going to hear about tonight. And it was truly a labor of love. And without further ado, I want to introduce Jane Beck.
Maybe I used to fly, but now I creep. First of all, I came up to see the History and Heritage Center, and I must say it blew me away. And this talk, I hope, is in honor of the History and Heritage Center. Now, it's an informal kind of talk, so stop me if you have questions, and we'll go from there. But I wanted to focus tonight on Daisy Turner and her family narrative. And the reason I feel that it is important is because the narrative encompasses 4 generations and close to 200 years from enslavement in Africa to a hillside farm in Grafton, Vermont. And it's a story told by the Turners and for the Turners, hopefully put in a historic and cultural context. Now, first and foremost, Daisy was a storyteller, and she learned at the feet of her father, who in turn learned from his father, who was born in West Africa, probably between 1802 and can you hear me?
Just
No?
do that.
Down here?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, better?
Yes.
Sorry, you should have spoken up. And between 1802 and 1810. And he was, as I said, was born in West Africa and was really part of the West African griot tradition. And the West African griot was a man of knowledge, a storyteller, a poet, a genealogist, and a historian. And Daisy served all those functions within her family. Now, I was first sent a clipping and a note about Daisy from Margaret MacArthur. There was a conversation about her at supper. Do most of you know her, the musician and singer? And she said to me, I think you should go meet Daisy. She has all kinds of songs and stories. And from the clipping that I saw, I thought that this was probably the case. And what I always liked to do was get an introduction to the person I was going to interview. And usually it was very easy. And you could even get an introduction to the governor, but I couldn't find anybody who would give me an introduction to Daisy. And pretty soon I discovered that she had a gun and wasn't afraid to use it. And so I decided I better write her a letter. So I wrote her a letter, and then I waited on tenterhooks for a week. And I knew at this point, this is 1983, I knew she was 100 years old. And so finally I called her, no answer. And then, of course, I started to worry, well, maybe she's not well, maybe she can't answer the telephone. Well, I called her again the next day. And I get this ringing, hello? And I think, is this a 100-year-old woman? Miss Turner? Yes. So then I started in on my spiel about how I wanted to meet her and talk with her. And suddenly she listened for about 10 seconds and turned the tables on me and bellowed at me, "Are you a prejudiced woman?" And I said, "I don't think so." And she said, "Well, come anytime." I said, "How about next Wednesday?" And we were off and running. I went down to see her, and she was a petite woman, but she had this big voice, and you didn't realize how small she was. And I was suddenly in Africa and Virginia and New Orleans and Vermont and Maine. And what was I hearing? And as you all know, memory is notoriously unreliable, but always meaningful. And the reason that it's considered unreliable is because of it encompasses emotion. Often when a memory is laid down, it's obviously subjective, but usually it's around an emotion. And I'll give you an example. There was a woman I interviewed called Gussie Laverne, and she grew up on a Moncton farm, and she remembered when electricity first came, and she was coming home from basketball practice, and suddenly the house was lit up like a Christmas tree. And she was so excited. She ran a little way and she cried, and then she ran a little more. But every time she told that story, even in her 80s, she couldn't tell it without crying. And this was the emotion welling up again. So this is, I think, one of the parts of memory that tends to color it and why we don't trust it. But at the same time, it's always important, and often events that are within your memory are ways to, you can use them as signposts in kind of discovery and further research. So Daisy was a marvelous storyteller, and she brought you right into the action, just as an African griot would have done. And here is an example.
And then on the top of it all, in the very midst of the terrible situation, Lincoln was shot dead. Well, then father said, as he, with his group, was getting ready to be mustered out, they heard, my father told it again and again, he heard the whoop, the Booth's horse as he rode running away from after shooting Lincoln. They was on the edge of Washington ready to be mustered out. And so father said, what a time.
Now, this is Daisy's father, and it was every night after dinner, he would tell stories of his past. And this is very unusual for somebody who was a former slave. They tended not to want to look back, only to look forward, but he wanted his children to know where they came from. And this is, again, part of the African griot tradition. He was dynamic, he was magnetic, and he was a marvelous storyteller. And he told stories that I call touchstone stories. The Turner narrative is based on what I call touchstone stories, pivotal moments. Again, around an emotional incident, like how he discovered the story about discovering what it meant to be a slave, or his most important touchstone story, killing the overseer and being able to physically turn his back on slavery. These are pivotal events, moments of change, and these are at the core of the Turner family narrative. Now, the narrative begins about 1802 to 1810, when an English woman went out on her father's trading vessel on her honeymoon. And her husband was what they call the supercargo, the major trader of the voyage. And Daisy always said they went to Cape Town. And I could never figure that out because I knew her family was Yoruba. Cape Town to me meant South Africa. But what I came to discover through my research is that the major English fort, which on the Gold Coast of Africa was called Cape Coast Castle. And the town behind Cape Coast Castle was called Cape Town. So this made sense. And, the ship went down the coast beyond Cape Town, and here's Cape Coast Castle, and went probably to Accra, Little Popo, Grand Popo, and probably somewhere around Porto Novo and Badagry. It met a line storm in those, which was called a tornado. It would come just before the rainy season, and it was a vicious storm, often called a hurricane, and the ship was sunk. The husband was drowned, and the new bride was rescued by an African chief's son, a Yoruba, who was a very powerful swimmer. And the fact that he was a powerful swimmer was always underscored in the narrative. And that was because on the coast of Benin, you don't swim. And this is an example of the surf, and there are all kinds of currents, and if you're not taken by the surf or the currents, you might be eaten by sharks. So it was not a pleasant place to swim. Daisy's great-grandmother, who was rescued, never returned to England. She had a child by her rescuer, and she and the child continued to live in the Yoruba village. The boy was named Alexander, after Alexander the Great, and grew up in the Yoruba tradition He became a trader, and then, as Daisy said, got too smart for his own good and began in the slave trade. And lo and behold, was captured as a slave himself and brought to this country in a schooner, a Spanish schooner out of Cuba, out of Havana, and brought to New Orleans. And in New Orleans, he was sold on the auction block, and he always said he was sold cheap because he was arrogant and a troublemaker. And I, from research, really discovered he was probably sold cheap because he was sold illegally. But at the same time, he was arrogant and a troublemaker, and this is probably what he wanted his family to remember. And it's important in your identity if you're arrogant and a troublemaker. So this is two voices we're hearing now. Now, he was sold to a man called John Golden of Port Royal, Virginia. And John Golden was a sporting man, and Alessi, the African slave, as I said, refused to work. So Golden put him to fighting gamecocks and boxing. And these boxing matches, they would be between slaves of different plantations. This happens to be the Tom Molyneux-Joe Cribbs fight, which Tom Molyneux was freed and then was sent to England and fought Joe Cribbs. But this was my illustration, anyway, of the boxing matches. And these matches between plantations were vicious matches. There was a tremendous amount of drinking, and they said there was more money won on one of these boxing matches than there was on horse racing. So this was kind of the underbelly of slavery. And John Golden, who was really, he came from a long line of yeoman farmers. None of them owned more than 200 or 300 acres. Suddenly, at the time that he, around the time that he buys Alessi, and he gives, this is confusing, he gives Alessi the name of Robert. By the time he has Robert, and Robert is boxing, he suddenly is able to buy 750 acres on the Rappahannock River, and eventually increases that to 2,000, which is really prime land. And only the aristocratic farmers, plantation owners, own this land. So I think he was doing very well betting on all these boxing matches and also cockfights. This is his plantation house, which still stands today. And Robert continued to box for him until he killed a Jamaican in the ring. And then he refused to fight anymore. And there was nothing that Golden could say that would change his mind. And so he was set to building a wheat barn. A rafter fell on him, and he was killed. Now, I think Golden was also affected by this boxing match where Robert killed the Jamaican, because he did something totally out of character. He had been a member of the Liberty Baptist Church, but as far as I could see from church records, he did nothing much in the running of the church. Suddenly, around the time of this boxing match, or just after, he takes a group of parishioners from the Liberty Baptist Church and forms the Bethesda Baptist Church, which is based on the non-sale or drinking of alcoholic beverages. And he helps them build the Bethesda Baptist Church, all of which was totally out of character. And after he does this, he plays a big role in the Bethesda Baptist Church. So I suspect that whatever happened at this boxing match, it was pretty grim. Now, Robert's son, Alec, born 1845, and his mother and siblings lived in a house right on the edge of the plantation. This is the plantation house here, as she was the seamstress. And Alec, as a young boy, would be playing with both black and white children up to the age of 5 or 6. And he began to notice that he was dressed differently than the white children. And the white children had long, fancy sleeves, and here he was in kind of this smock and no shoes. And so he asks his mother about this, and she doesn't really answer him, but she makes him a pair of red moccasins with beaded toe pieces. She was Cherokee. And he loves them, and he loves to strut around in them. And he begins to notice that every time white people come down, she takes them off him and puts them away. But one day he's strutting around in them, and down comes Mistress Golden to see about a dress for her granddaughter's 8th birthday. And she sees Alec in these red moccasins, and she takes them off his feet and throws them in the fire. And he is furious. He's 5 years old. He hits her, he bites her, he scratches her, and she falls in a swoon. And all he remembers is the awful look in his mother's eye. And she's scared that he's going to be sold off the plantation. Well, somehow that doesn't happen. And his mother pulls herself together and finishes the dress, and in a couple of days takes it up to the big house. And they go in through this hallway, which is, there are tables all around here, festooned with sweet cakes and cookies and all good things. And they go through here and they go up this enclosed staircase up above, and Rose tries the dress on Zeffie, and it fits perfectly. And she calls Alec, who is already coming down the stairs ahead of her, headed straight for a plate of ginger soldier cookies that he grabs in both hands and is busily biting off the heads. And he's in trouble all over again. This time, he is punished, and he is given the job of carrying pails of water up and down the rows of slaves that are working here in this field. So he did that for probably 3 weeks or so. And then as he gets older, he's given the chore of watching the cattle and the sheep. And eventually, he is set to work in the milk house. And here, outside the milk house, he and Zeffie are friends, the young granddaughter. She's 3 years older than he is. And she tells him that he needs to be free, that she will help him if he wants to run away to Vermont, where he can be free. Now, I don't know whether the Vermont was stuck on by Daisy or not in later times, but this is how she always told the story. And Alec was there with Zeffie, working with, she had brought down a primer, and she is teaching Alec to read, which is totally forbidden in Virginia. And the grandmother comes down, finds them, sends Zeffie to the house. Alec holds onto the primer. She lashes him, but he won't give up the primer. He bleeds on the primer. He had this tremendous cut. And the primer is something that he carried with him throughout the Civil War after he escaped. That was how important it was to him. And it is at this moment that he decides he has to be free. And he begins saving money, stealing money, and burying it to eventually buy himself. He is given other jobs, and one of the things he likes best are the spirituals or the work songs sung on the plantation. And he told his daughters all the songs and when they were sung. And this particular one, it was sung while seining. Anyway, you get the flavor of it, but this was where he first learned to sing, and his religious foundation, the singing of spirituals, and the telling of stories were very much a part of Alec Turner. Now, it's gotten to be 1862, and the plantation is right between Washington and Richmond, and the Confederate soldiers are on the plantation, and in a closet in this plantation house is kind of a listing of things that the Goldens had loaned to the soldiers. There is a bed quilt, 2 white counterpanes, father's blanket, which suggests that this was written by J. Frank Golden. And there was also, on the other side of the Rappahannock, the 1st New Jersey Cavalry facing these Confederates on the Golden side of the Rappahannock. And Ferdinand Dayton was an assistant surgeon, and he apparently came across in a boat and found Alec, and Alec told his children later he didn't know what made him so brave, but he talked with Dayton and arranged that when he waved a white flag, Dayton would come over in a boat and take to the other side Alec and whoever was with him. And this was how Alec made his escape from the Golden plantation. He was 16 years old, and just by crossing the river, he became a free man. He had been called Alec Berkeley. He now took the name Alec Turner because if Golden came looking for him, he could come in and say, that guy is Alec Berkeley, he's my slave, and he could take him. But if he said, that guy is Alec Berkeley, and he was now Alec Turner, he could not take him. So this was the reason of the name change. And there was a woman called Turner that Alec had worked for and liked. And so he honored her with that name. Now, there were a couple of other slaves with Alec, and this guy here heard them talking, and they were talking about 9 Confederates that were at the Golden plantation. And he wanted to take 20 volunteers and Alec and the other escapees helped lead them across the Rappahannock and it was actually the Thomas Golden Plantation, which was right next to the John Golden Plantation, and to the Chestnut Grove Plantation. And Alec helped lead them, and when the men got there, they captured an outpost of 8 or 9 vedettes, and while they were doing that, Alec went half a mile away to the overseer's house and shot the overseer. And this was the overseer that had been head of the whipping post, who had meted out all of Alec's punishments over the years. And by doing this, Alec was able to overcome slavery and turn his back on it, both figuratively and literally. And then he was able to look toward the future. He became an orderly for Ferdinand Dayton, fought in a number of battles. The last one was the Battle of Gettysburg. And then Dayton went into a new, or helped set up the 2nd New Jersey Cavalry and took Alec with him again. And they were waiting in Arlington for their orders, and Alec was given a furlough. And while he's on furlough, the orders come through, and when he returns, the troops are gone. Can you imagine how he must have felt? Now, he never talked about this with his children. And the only way I discovered it was through his pension file. And it said he wrote the letter saying that he had been on furlough, that the orders had come through, and he was left behind, and he was sent to City Point. And City Point had a couple of hospitals for both the Northerners and the Southerners, and then, as you know, it became Grant's headquarters. So he was there throughout the rest of the Civil War, a year and a half, which there was just no story at all about that. So this must have been a very low time for him, or perhaps his children were only interested in the battles. I don't know, but it is a real hole in his story. But the interesting thing is that after the Civil War, Dayton comes back and finds Alec and takes him home to New Jersey, gets him a job with a grocery store, and gets him into night school for 2 years. Alec then returns to Washington and through the Freedmen's Bureau gets a job with A.H. Merrill in Williamsburg, Maine, and becomes a leading force there. And I was able to find all the quarry records, and Alec Turner was top wage earner for 5 years there. It was incredible. And also his comings and goings I could see. He became a foreman. He is taking men back and forth, getting new quarry workers in Virginia. And on these trips, he meets his future wife, Sally Early, and marries her. And Merrill dresses them both in wedding clothes, and they return to the quarry, and Alec continues to work. The interesting thing he was obviously foreman, and you can see his wages going up by 25 cents or something. But then, as the blacks, the freedmen, begin to leave, because Maine is freezing cold, during the winter, they get pneumonia, and they do not thrive in that climate. And as the blacks leave, Merrill has to get other quarry workers, and he goes and gets a bunch of Swedes, and then Alec's take-home pay goes down. He's obviously demoted, but you can see him continuing to work more than one job and getting his pay right back up. But I'm sure that that was an evidence of racial discrimination. This is Sally, his wife. She was 14 when he married her. Obviously, this is later, but she's a beautiful woman. And they had twins right off the bat, and then a third daughter. And she became very ill, clinging to life. Merrill takes her down and gets her to a doctor at Mass General, and gets Alec a job at loading freight. And during that time, her life is clinging in the balance. Alec is reading the newspapers, looking for another job, meets Charles White from Grafton, Vermont, who has a sawmill. White tells him Grafton is a very healthy place. He thinks about his wife, and he says the feeling just went right through him, and he came up to Grafton, checked it out. He likes the men there, although they tell him that he will not be able to put salt in his bread, meaning that he won't earn enough money to put salt in his bread, which is an expensive commodity. And he's determined to prove them wrong, so he has a 4-pound axe made because he knows that Vermonters use a 3.5-pound axe. So he brings his family to Vermont, and his conduit into the village really is through the general store, and he helps the proprietor unload barrels of flour and grain, and he's also a fine storyteller and singer, and he begins to get to know the men that way. But the crux of the matter is his power.
Bill Wyman said, if you can carry a barrel of that flour to Sally and the children on the hill, I'll give it to you. Or Father said you were lost, because I'll pick it up when I go. So Father finally got ready and got started. So he put the barrel of flour, and he told me many a time just how to do it. Just right parallel on his shoulder, and started. When he got to the bridge, the first bridge up there, he didn't take it all, but he changed it like that, a little like that, over just a little bit further, because he said he found out, he knew he had to make the hill, and the valve would have to lay a certain way then. So he shifted it then, and went on. And my father, glory to his name, Alexander, my father, I'm proud to be your daughter, went on up that road and up that hill and across that long field, because we lived in the shanty, and my father never set that barrel down until he got up in the shanty door. And that must have been at that time 40 men all following him with little jugs of Jimmy John and hard cider and all. And Mother told many a time how after they all got drunk. After Father set the barrel of cider down, and they all was saluting him and congratulating on him. And my father carried that barrel of flour from Grafton Village up on our hilltop for us children to eat, to have bread. Now that's the truth, if I never speak a word again.
She's quite a storyteller, isn't she? Alec, with his 4-pound axe, helped clear the land and then was able to buy it cheap. And I think he was also protected by the town fathers. He did not apparently, at least according to his children and grandchildren, did not experience a lot of racial discrimination. And I think this was because the town fathers were all abolitionists. They'd been involved in the Underground Railroad. Here was a slave, and they were going to help this slave. And furthermore, as people got to know Alec, his charisma, his dynamism was quickly recognized, and his hard work ethic. And so he came to Grafton in 1873. He was a laborer. By 1877, when his daughter was born, he was now a farmer. And he built himself a house in 1886 for his growing family. And his family really became part of the community, part of the Hill Farm community. They shared work, and they really were part of the community. They went to school. This is Daisy here. This is her older sister, Susie. This is Willie, Susie's twin, who was a bit of a problem child, we might call him today, or he was always on the edge. For example, his mother they always killed poultry, which they would send to the Boston market. And Willie watched all this and watched these chickens running around without their heads and wondered if his sister would run around if he cut off her head with his father's 4-pound axe. And the mother just was able to get there in time. That was Willie. And Alec, this became the family homestead. This is one of his first grandchildren, Willie Samuels. So suddenly, Alec Turner becomes a homesteader. And then I thought I'd give you kind of a brief run-through of his family. And this is one of the oldest girls, Rose. She kept an account book, not quite a diary, but she would mention when her sisters first came to Boston. And all the girls tended to go to Boston when they got to be in their late teens and needed jobs, and also wanted a sociable community. And those that married African Americans married down in Boston. This is Rose's twin sister, Rachel, who became a practical nurse in Everett, Mass. And this is Nellie, who was the first to be married in 1903. And she had her son Willie, who you saw on Alec's knee. He was 21, I think, when this photograph was taken, and a drummer and a great athlete, and was running in a race and had a brain aneurysm and died at 21, which was just a tremendous blow. He had been about to go to law school, and so it was a real tragedy for the Turners. Lindsay was the first son, and he had 2 sons with illegitimate sons with a woman who had a large family, and she brought the sons up in her excuse me in her family. And this was Leslie, and I got a call several years ago from his daughter Janet, who was going to Ireland and needed her passport. And she had to get her birth certificate and on it noticed that her father had an M after his name, Mulatto. And she's 50, and she didn't know anything about this, and she went off to Ireland and she stewed about it and came back and asked her mother, and sure enough, it turns out that Lindsay Turner was her grandfather. And her daughter, Tamara, interviewed her grandmother, which it was obviously a very difficult subject for the grandmother to talk about. They had faced a lot of discrimination from the town, but also from the grandmother's own family who had disowned her. So we see another side of Grafton in this story. Tamara did all this research and then told her siblings, and also David Rogers, her first cousin. And when he hears, he pulls off his hat and says, "Now I know why my hair goes crazy when it rains." And he then told his friends, and those friends that had grown up in Grafton knew it, which says something about Grafton doesn't forget. And it was David Rogers who I was able to test with those genome tests you do on the side of your mouth. And it came back Yoruba, as Daisy had said they were. This is Willie, grown up, the one that was after his sister with a 4-pound axe. He became a corporal during World War I, he won the Croix de Guerre. He was quite a man. And his twin sister, Susie, she had wanted to be a nurse, but she fainted at the sight of blood. So she got married instead, had her daughter, Ronnie Lanier, who was a much beloved Baptist minister and the first black New England Baptist minister. She lived to be 95 and just was a pistol. Her brother Chester won the Golden Gloves in 1932. So this athletic power and skill went on through the generations. Now, after the twins, there was another child they named him Alexander. He was the 8th child, and they nicknamed him Enough. He unfortunately died of pneumonia, and after he died, they had 5 more girls. Daisy being the first of them. Now, Daisy never married, although she had a very strong affair with a white man, Joseph Bonet, and it was they were supposed to be married Christmas Day. The 20th of December, her father took very ill. She went home, he died. She dealt with the funeral. When she came back, she discovered that Joseph Bonet had been with another woman. And she brought suit for breach of promise in the Cambridge Court, East Cambridge Court in Massachusetts, and she won a settlement of $3,750. And this is the first case of a black woman against a white man, and she had a jury of 12 white men. So it's quite amazing. And the photograph in the Boston Globe, underneath it, Daisy in this big hat says, "I have been vindicated." Violet is the first to marry a white man, and I think her father was quite upset about it. He did not want his children to intermarry. And she certainly experienced prejudice. And this is a card that George Hall got saying, "I am coming to Chester next week. Don't run to Nigger Hill." And I think this is only a sign of what they experienced. And Godfrey, their son, kept this card all his life. This is Godfrey, his last walk up Turner Hill, and every tree, every stone had a story. And as I walked up with him, I suddenly felt I was inhabiting this narrative that I had been hearing about. Zebby was the first daughter born in the new house, and she was named after Zeffie, the little girl that taught Alec to read. And Evelyn also married a white man, Dave Carlson, and this is 2 of their 3 daughters. And the last one is Florida. She also married a white man, an Italian called Di Benedetto. And this child, I am almost certain, is another of Lindsay's children. And imagine having, this would be Bill Rogers. He was actually older than Leslie. Imagine this child growing up in a white family. It must have been really tough. Now, as I said, the Turner Hill became a homestead, and all the family would come there at every opportunity. All the grandchildren came all summer and hung out together and worked on the farm. And here is Alec and Sally, probably around 1922. Alec died in 1923. And just think what their lives entailed. Both born slaves, and now in Vermont, not only are they free, they have close to 200 acres of land, a family homestead, and things looked very bright. And Daisy, this is Daisy on her 104th birthday, with all of her storytelling talents. Daisy really believed that her story would not be taken seriously until it was written. And she was after me to write it right away. And I promised her I would write it. I knew I needed the time to frame it historically. Otherwise, it wouldn't be given the credence it was due. And by documenting it, I felt that it would dispel some of the criticisms we hear today of oral history. But it is an amazing story of an American family that has lived through all of our critical times in American history, and it gives us a different voice. Thanks. Questions?
Is were the buildings still on the place?
The house burned
Yes.
in 1962. It was actually burned down. The only building that is left now is Birchdale Camp, which the Preservation Trust is trying to preserve.
That's the one Daisy lived in?
Daisy lived in the house until it was burned.
Yeah.
And then she moved to Birchdale Camp. She lived on and off in Birchdale Camp through the years. But then eventually moved off the hill and lived with her sister Zebby.
Oh, I see, yeah. So the dance hall was gone then?
The dance hall, yeah, I saw the dance hall. In fact, on the 10th of August was Alec's birthday, and the Turners used to celebrate his birthday, and we used to go up to the dance hall and celebrate it.
Yeah.
But that has since fallen down. I don't know what happened to the piano in it. There was still a piano there when I was there.
Is that right? Yeah. That's the only dance hall I was ever in where the bathroom was actually on the dance floor.
I didn't know that.
We used to, I played with a country western band, and we used to go up there and dance up there once in a while. Daisy just loved it, to get something going. And there was no lights in the dance hall. I can't remember what it was wired or not. It must have been, because I was working on the interstates there when they built them, and we borrowed the light plant from from the company. They had to lug it out across that swamp and get a couple of plants side by side and lug that white plant up. Wasn't too bad lugging it over, but you come back about midnight afterwards and and that white plant was the old-fashioned type that all the windings and big armature and everything in it. Must have weighed 36 ounces to a pound, I think.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's, I have, let's see if I can find it, a picture here. Oh, how do I get rid of this? Oh, never mind. Here we go.
As a family, the Turners were known for their musical talents and often held concerts and dances up on their hill in what became known as the Turner Dance Hall. All the neighbors would gather round and there would be jugs of cider and fun for everybody.
I used to be able to call. When they square dances and father and them would call these different things. Get your little round heads ready and washed up on the floor. 8 hands round and get together. And then they would all dance and everybody had a nice time. Balance a partner, double 4. Back hands round and then swing again. Meet the other fellow on his own ground. And the different ladies would show the gentlemen how well they could dance. And then swing your own partner and then the same. Back to your place and try it again. Have awful good times, you know. My father then gave these little
Anyway, that was the dance hall.
Yeah.
Yes.
The chairwoman of the English department, Dartmouth, Gretchen
Gerzina.
has done another documentary of another African-American family that began as slaves down in Deerfield.
Right, the princes.
Yes. Now, is this in fact going to prove eventually to be a succession of these wonderful stories? I mean, are these the two?
I don't know. They're the only 2 I know about. But the amazing thing to me was I was always, Mrs. Prince went and did much of what Daisy did in court. And this ability of making up poems. And they lived, 100 years apart. So I don't know. The other night I was giving a talk at Rokeby, and an African-American woman came up to me and said, I'm so glad you've done this. There are a lot more of these stories out there. And I'm hoping that maybe something like this will spur them to come forward. Okay, well, thank you very much.